The message came at 12:13 a.m. The harsh glow of my phone screen cut through the dim hospital room, lighting up my face in cold blue. For a second, I didn't move. I had been drifting in that fragile space between exhaustion and sleep, my head tilted awkwardly against the edge of the chair, my neck stiff, my body heavy. The sound of the notification had been soft, barely more than a vibration, but it was enough to pull me back into reality. Back into everything. I reached for the phone slowly, my fingers sluggish, as if they didn't quite belong to me. My eyes struggled to focus, still dry and burning from too many sleepless nights. And then I read it. I was the one who pulled this all by myself! Ungrateful. We left Mom. Call me when you cool down. I blinked. Once, twice. The words didn't make sense at first. They felt disjointed, like pieces of a conversation I hadn't fully heard. But then they settled, sinking into me, heavy and sharp. Ungrateful. The word echoed in my mind, louder than the steady beeping of the monitor beside my mother's bed. Louder than the distant footsteps in the hallway. Louder than the quiet hum of machines that had become the background noise of my life. Ungrateful. My grip tightened around the phone. I read the message again. Slower this time, as if maybe I had misunderstood. As if maybe there was something hidden between the lines that would make it hurt less. But there wasn't. It was exactly what it looked like. A verdict. A dismissal. A slap across the face wrapped in casual indifference. I exhaled slowly, but it came out uneven. Almost like a quiet laugh that didn't quite form. My chest felt tight, like something inside me was pressing outward, trying to break free. We left Mom. My eyes moved instinctively to the bed. She was still there, exactly where I had been all night, exactly where I had been for the last 3 nights. Her face looked smaller somehow, her skin pale under the soft hospital light. The oxygen tube rested beneath her nose, and every breath she took seemed careful. Measured, like her body had to remember how to keep going. I watched her for a long moment, making sure she was still breathing, still here, still mine to take care of. A lump formed in my throat, thick and stubborn. I swallowed it down, but it didn't go away. It just sat there, heavy and suffocating. We left Mom. No, you didn't leave her. You were never really here. My thumb hovered over the screen. For a second, I thought about replying. About typing something. Anything that could release the storm building inside me. I imagined the words spilling out, sharp and unfiltered. All the things I had swallowed for years finally clawing their way to the surface. But my fingers didn't move. Because what would I even say? How do you explain exhaustion to someone who has never stayed? How do you defend yourself against a story that's already been written about you? Ungrateful. I let out a slow breath and lowered the phone to my lap. The plastic chair beneath me creaked softly as I shifted, the sound too loud in the quiet room. My body ached in places I hadn't noticed before. My shoulders, my back, even my hands felt sore, like they had been clenched for too long. Maybe they had. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 20:17 a.m. 4 minutes had passed. It felt like hours. The hospital at night was a different world. During the day, it was full of movement, doctors, nurses, visitors, voices overlapping in a constant hum of activity. But at night, everything slowed down. The lights dimmed. The voices softened. Even the air felt heavier, as if it carried the weight of everything people were trying not to say. I had grown used to it. Too used to it. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, and rubbed my face with both hands. My skin felt dry, my eyes sore. When I pulled my hands away, I noticed the faint tremble in my fingers. I hadn't realized how tired I was. Not just physically, but in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix. I looked at my mother again. A strand of her hair had fallen across her forehead, and without thinking, I stood up and gently brushed it aside. My movements were careful, almost instinctive. I had done this so many times now that it felt like second nature. She didn't wake. For a moment, I just stood there, watching her, listening to the steady rhythm of the monitor, counting each breath like it was something fragile, something that could disappear if I stopped paying attention. "I'm here?" I whispered, even though she couldn't hear me. Or maybe I was saying it for myself, because sometimes it felt like I needed the reminder. I pulled the blanket up slightly, tucking it around her shoulders, making sure she was warm. Small things. Simple things. The kind of things no one ever notices. The kind of things that somehow become everything. When I sat back down, the phone was still in my lap. The screen had gone dark, but the message felt like it was still there, etched into my mind. Ungrateful. I let out a quiet breath and leaned back in the chair, staring up at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights above flickered faintly, casting soft shadows across the room. I tried to think of a time when things hadn't felt like this. When being part of this family hadn't felt like carrying a weight that no one else could see. But the memories that came were blurred, distant, like something I had imagined rather than lived. Maybe it had always been this way. Maybe I had just been too busy trying to hold everything together to notice. My phone buzzed again, a short vibration against my leg. My heart jumped, a reflex I couldn't control. For a split second, I thought it might be him again. Another message, another accusation. But when I looked, it was just a low battery warning, 2%. I stared at it for a moment, then let out a soft, humorless laugh. Of course. Even my phone was running out of everything. I reached for the charger beside the wall, plugging it in with slow, deliberate movements. The small act felt strangely grounding, like I was anchoring myself to something simple, something I could control. Unlike everything else. Once it was connected, I placed the phone face down on the small table next to me. I didn't want to see it anymore. Not tonight. Tonight, I didn't have the energy to fight invisible battles or defend myself against words that had already done their damage. Tonight, all I could do was sit in this quiet room, in this fragile moment, and exist. I pulled my legs up slightly, curling into the chair, and rested my head back. My eyes drifted closed, but sleep didn't come. Only thoughts, heavy, relentless thoughts that refused to settle. Ungrateful. The word echoed again. Softer this time, but no less sharp. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to push it away. I let it sit there. I let it hurt. Because somewhere beneath the exhaustion, beneath the anger, beneath the quiet ache that had become my constant companion, something was shifting. Something small. Something dangerous. A question. What if I wasn't the problem? The thought lingered, fragile but persistent, like a crack forming in something that had once felt unbreakable. And as I sat there in the dim hospital room, listening to my mother breathe, I realized something that scared me more than the message itself. I didn't feel guilty. I felt tired. Tired of proving myself. Tired of carrying everything. Tired of being the one who stayed while everyone else walked away. My eyes opened slowly, and I turned my head to look at my mother again. "I'm still here," I whispered, my voice barely audible. But this time, the words felt different. Not like a promise, not like an obligation, but like a choice. And maybe, just maybe, that was where everything would begin to change. It hadn't always felt this heavy. There was a time when the word, family, didn't sit in my chest like a burden. Back then, it meant warmth, noise. Shared meals where laughter filled the spaces between conversations. It meant knowing someone would catch you if you fell. I held on to those memories longer than I should have. Because the truth is, everything changed the day my father died. It wasn't just the loss. It was the silence that followed. The kind that settles into walls, into routines, into people. Overnight, our house stopped feeling like a home and started feeling like something fragile, like one wrong move could shatter whatever was left holding us together. At the center of it all was Hamza, my older brother, confident, loud, certain in a way I had never been. He stepped forward immediately, like he had been waiting for the role. Relatives praised him, neighbors admired him, and suddenly everyone spoke about him with a kind of respect that felt almost rehearsed. He's the man of the house now. He's taking responsibility. He's just like his father. I remember standing in the background during those conversations, nodding along, forcing small smiles when people looked at me, as if I was part of the same story. But I wasn't. Because while Hamza became the face of our family's strength, I became everything else. The parts no one talked about. At first, it didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt necessary. Mom wasn't coping well. Some days she wouldn't get out of bed. Other days she would move through the house like a ghost, doing things halfway, forgetting what she had started. Grief clung to her like a shadow, heavy and unrelenting. Someone had to be there. So I stayed. I told myself it was temporary, that once things settled, once she got better, I would go back to my life. Back to university. Back to the version of myself that had plans and dreams, and a future that didn't revolve around survival. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when no one questions it. I remember the day I stopped going to classes. I didn't make a big decision. There was no dramatic moment. It was quiet, almost invisible. I missed a week because mom needed me. Then another. Assignments piled up. Messages from professors went unanswered. And eventually, it just ended. No one asked me about it. Not Hamza, not our relatives, not even mom. Though I don't blame her for that. She had her own battles. It was as if my life outside that house had simply ceased to exist. And everyone was okay with it. Including me, at least, that's what I told myself. Hamza, on the other hand, seemed to be everywhere. He was always handling things. Always working. Always making connections. He spoke in big words and bigger promises, and people listened. Whenever relatives visited, he would sit with them in the living room, discussing finances, plans, responsibilities. His voice carried confidence, authority. I stayed in the kitchen most of the time, preparing tea, serving snacks, cleaning up after. Occasionally, someone would call my name, asking how I was doing. I would smile and say, "I'm fine," because it was easier than explaining everything that I didn't have the energy to put into words. And then the conversation would shift back to him. It didn't happen all at once, this shift between us. It was gradual, subtle, like water wearing down stone over time. Hamza started making decisions without asking me. About the house. About money. About mom's care. At first, I didn't mind. I trusted him. He was older. He seemed to know what he was doing. But then I started noticing the gaps. He wasn't there when mom had one of her bad days, when she refused to eat or forgot where she was. He wasn't there when the electricity bill was overdue, and I had to figure out how to stretch what little money we had. He wasn't there for the quiet, exhausting work that filled every hour of my day. He showed up for the visible parts. The conversations. The decisions. The moments that could be seen, acknowledged, praised. And every time he did, people would look at him like he was holding the entire family together. I remember one evening in particular. A group of relatives had come over. It had been one of those long, draining days where nothing seemed to go right. Mom had barely spoken. I had spent hours trying to get her to eat something, anything, and by the time evening came, I felt like I was running on nothing. Hamza arrived just before they did. He walked in like he always did, confident, composed, carrying an energy that filled the room. Within minutes, he was sitting with them, talking, explaining, assuring. "I've got everything under control," he said at one point, his voice steady. I stood in the doorway, holding a tray of tea, and felt something twist inside me. Everything. I wanted to laugh, but I didn't. I walked in, set the tray down, poured the tea, and handed it out one cup at a time. No one noticed the way my hands shook slightly. No one asked why I looked so tired. And when one of the relatives turned to me and said, "You're lucky to have a brother like him," I smiled. Because that's what I had learned to do. Smile, stay quiet, don't complicate things. That night, after everyone left, I cleaned up alone. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. I moved slowly, mechanically, washing dishes, wiping surfaces, putting everything back in its place. Hamza had already gone. He said he had an early meeting. Of course he did. I stood at the sink, staring at my reflection in the dark window. For a moment, I didn't recognize the person looking back at me. She looked smaller. Not physically, but in a way that felt harder to define. Like parts of her had been chipped away, piece by piece, until all that was left was something functional. Something useful. But not whole. I splashed some water on my face, trying to shake the feeling, trying to push it down where it wouldn't interfere with everything I needed to keep doing, because stopping wasn't an option. Not then. Not when Mom needed me. Not when there was no one else. So I kept going, day after day, week after week, month after month. And somewhere along the way, I stopped asking for recognition. I stopped expecting it. Because it was easier to believe that this was just how things were supposed to be. That this was my role. That this was my place. But even then, deep down, There was a part of me that noticed. A part that kept track of every moment I was overlooked, every time my effort was dismissed, every instance where his version of the story became the only one that mattered. I just didn't realize what that part was becoming. Not yet. Back then, I still believed that if I gave enough, if I stayed long enough, if I carried enough, someone would finally see me. I didn't know that the person who needed to see me the most was me. The hospital bills didn't arrive all at once. They came slowly, quietly, slipping into my life like something almost harmless at first. A printed sheet here, a payment reminder there, numbers that didn't seem real until they started adding up. At the beginning, I told myself it was manageable, that this was just a phase, that once Mom stabilized, once the treatment slowed down, things would ease. But they didn't. Each visit brought new tests. Each test brought new costs. Each cost came with a deadline that didn't care about my situation, my exhaustion, or how much I was already holding together. I kept every bill in a folder. At first, it was just a way to stay organized. I would smooth out the paper, read through the details carefully, then slide it into place like I was filing away something temporary. But over time, the folder grew thicker, heavier, harder to close. One night, I opened it and spread everything out across the small table in the hospital room. Page after page, covered in numbers, medical terms I barely understood, and totals that made my chest tighten. I stared at them for a long time, trying to make sense of it all. Trying to figure out how I was supposed to keep up. My bank account had already started shrinking in ways that felt irreversible. I knew exactly how much I had left. I checked it more often than I wanted to admit, like somehow staring at the number would make it change. It never did. The first thing I sold was my jewelry. It wasn't a dramatic decision. There was no hesitation, no emotional breakdown. I simply took the small box from my drawer, opened it, and looked at what was inside. A delicate gold bracelet from my 18th birthday. A pair of earrings I had worn once and then saved for special occasions that never seemed to come. A simple chain my father had given me years ago, back when things were different. I held each piece for a moment, letting the memories flicker through my mind. Then I closed the box. Memories didn't pay hospital bills. The shop owner didn't ask questions. He weighed everything carefully, quoted a price that I knew was lower than what it was worth, and waited. I didn't argue. I just nodded and handed it over. Walking out of that shop felt strange. Not painful, not exactly. Just empty. Like I had given away something more than metal and stones, but I didn't have the time or energy to figure out what. The money helped. For a while. But, while. Doesn't last long when the expenses don't stop. The next thing to go was my laptop. That decision was harder. It wasn't just an object. It was the last real connection I had to the life I had left behind. My university work, my notes, unfinished projects, all of it lived there, frozen in time. Selling it felt like closing a door I hadn't been ready to shut. I remember sitting with it in my lap for a long time before making the decision. Running my fingers over the keyboard, staring at the screen, as if I could somehow hold on to what it represented just a little longer. But reality has a way of cutting through hesitation. I needed the money. So I sold it. And just like that, another piece of my life disappeared. I told myself it didn't matter. That I could always start again later. That this was temporary, just like everything else. But deep down, I felt the shift. The quiet realization that I was giving up things I might never get back. Still, I kept going. Because what other choice did I have? Hamza sent money sometimes. Not regularly. Not predictably. Just enough to remind me that he existed in this situation, but not enough to actually carry any real weight. And every time he did, it came with words. Words that lingered longer than the money ever did. Do you know how hard I work? I'm dealing with a lot right now. You have no idea what kind of pressure I'm under. I would stare at those messages the same way I stared at the hospital bills. Quietly, carefully, trying to understand something that never quite made sense. Pressure. I wondered what that felt like, coming from him. Because from where I stood, pressure wasn't an abstract concept. It wasn't something you talked about. It was something you lived. It was the weight of responsibility that didn't lift when you were tired. The constant awareness that if you stopped, even for a moment, everything could fall apart. But I never said any of that. I never replied with anger or frustration. I just accepted the money, sent a simple, "thank you," and moved on. Because arguing would have taken energy I didn't have. And because a part of me still hoped that maybe, eventually, he would understand. That maybe one day, he would show up, not just physically, but fully. But that day never came. When Mom's condition worsened, it happened quickly. One moment, things felt stable, fragile but stable. And the next, everything shifted. Her breathing became more labored. She was weaker, more disoriented. The doctors spoke in careful tones, using words that sounded controlled, but carried an undercurrent of urgency. I listened to everything, asked questions, took notes. Because I had to. Because there was no one else who would. That night, sitting beside her bed, I felt something close to fear settle into my chest. Not panic. Not yet. But the kind of quiet fear that sits heavy, making every breath feel deliberate. I reached for my phone and called Hamza. It rang longer than I expected. Once, twice, 3 times. For a moment I thought he wouldn't answer. But then he did. Yeah. His voice was casual, distracted. "I need you to come," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Mum's not doing well. The doctors are concerned." There was a pause. Not long. Just enough for something inside me to tighten. "I can't right now," he said. I blinked, not sure I had heard him correctly. "What?" "I've got work," he continued, like this was a normal conversation. "Important meetings." "I told you, things are intense here?" I gripped the phone a little tighter. "Hamza, I'm serious. You need to be here?" Another pause. Then, a sigh. "I've already done enough." The words landed harder than I expected. Not loud, not dramatic. Just final, like a door closing. For a second, I couldn't speak. Everything I had done, everything I had given up. Every sleepless night, every sacrifice, every moment spent holding things together. Reduced to nothing. "I'll try to come later," he added, almost as an afterthought. "But don't keep calling me like this." The line went quiet. He had already hung up. I lowered the phone slowly, my hand suddenly feeling heavier than it should. For a long moment I just sat there. The sounds of the hospital continued around me. The steady beeping of machines, the distant murmur of voices, the soft hum of life moving forward. But inside me, something had shifted. Not broken, not completely. But cracked in a way that couldn't be ignored anymore. I looked at my mother, at the rise and fall of her chest. At the fragile thread that seemed to hold everything together. And then I looked at the folder of bills sitting on the table. At the empty space where my belongings used to be. At my own reflection in the darkened window. And for the first time, a thought surfaced. Not quietly, not gently, but with a clarity that cut through everything else. I had been doing this alone. Not partially. Not temporarily. Completely. And suddenly. The question wasn't how much more I could give. It was how much more I was willing to lose, before there was nothing left of me to give at all. The argument didn't start all at once. It built slowly, like pressure rising beneath the surface, until there was nowhere left for it to go. It happened in the hospital corridor, just outside my mother's room. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, too clean, too sharp. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting everything in a pale, unforgiving glow. It was the kind of place where emotions didn't belong, where everything was supposed to stay controlled, quiet, contained. But nothing about that moment was contained. Hamza had arrived without warning. I hadn't even known he was coming until I saw him walking down the corridor. His footsteps steady, his posture confident, like he belonged there. Like this was just another place he could step into and take control of. For a second, I felt something close to relief. It was automatic, instinctive. He's here. But just as quickly, it faded. Because being here and actually being present were two very different things. And I had learned that the hard way. "You didn't answer my messages," he said as soon as he reached me, his tone already edged with irritation. I stared at him for a moment, caught off guard by the accusation. "I've been a little busy," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. He glanced past me, toward the room. "How is she?" "Not good," I said. "The doctors are still running tests. They're not sure how things are going to go." He nodded, but it felt distracted, like his mind was already somewhere else. I told you I'd come when I could, he said. Something inside me tightened. When you could. I repeated, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He frowned slightly. Yeah, I have responsibilities too, you know. I let out a small, disbelieving breath. Responsibilities. The word hung between us, heavier than it should have been. His expression hardened. What's that supposed to mean? I hesitated for a second. Just 1 second. Because I could feel it, the line I was about to cross. The one I had avoided for years. The one that separated silence from truth. And then I crossed it. It means, I said slowly, that you don't get to show up once in a while and act like you've been carrying all of this. His eyes narrowed. I never said that. You didn't have to. I replied, my voice gaining strength. You let everyone else say it for you. He took a step closer, his presence suddenly more imposing. I have been supporting this family. Supporting? I repeated, a bitter edge creeping into my tone. Is that what you call it? What would you call it? He shot back. I felt something snap. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just enough to finally let everything I had been holding in spill out. I would call it convenient. I said, my words sharper now. You send money when it suits you, you show up when people are watching, and then you disappear when things actually get hard. His face darkened. That's not fair. Fair. I let out a hollow laugh. You want to talk about fair? A couple of nurses glanced in our direction as they passed. Their expressions neutral but curious. I barely noticed. I dropped out of university. I continued, my voice shaking but steady enough to keep going. I've been taking care of Mom every single day. I've been dealing with the bills, the doctors, everything. And you think sending money every now and then makes you the one who's pulled this all by yourself? He flinched slightly at that, but his expression didn't soften. You're being emotional, he said, his tone colder now. You always do this. You blow things out of proportion. I stared at him, disbelief flooding through me. My problem? I said, my voice dropping, quieter but heavier. My problem is that I believed you were actually helping. I am helping, he insisted. Do you have any idea what I've had to deal with? The pressure, the expectations. Stop. I cut in, my voice sharper than I intended. He fell silent, surprised. Just stop, I repeated, softer this time, but no less firm. I'm tired of hearing about your pressure like it's the only thing that matters. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The corridor felt too quiet, too still. Like the world had paused just to watch this unfold. I gave up my future for this family. I said finally, the words coming out slower now, heavier with meaning. For Mom. For you. I didn't complain. I didn't ask for anything. And now you stand here and call me ungrateful. His jaw tightened. I didn't mean it like that, he said, but there was no real conviction in his voice. Then how did you mean it? I asked. He didn't answer. Because there was no answer that could fix this. No explanation that could undo years of being overlooked, dismissed, taken for granted. You don't see me? I continued, my voice barely above a whisper now, but somehow stronger than before. You never have. That's not true, he said quickly. Then what is? I challenged. Tell me one time you actually showed up when it mattered. Not for appearances. Not for other people. For me. For Mom. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. And in that silence, everything became clear. I nodded slowly, the last piece falling into place. That's what I thought. Something shifted in his expression then. Something defensive, almost desperate. But it was too late. Pride had already taken over. You think you're the only one who's done anything, he snapped, his voice rising. I built everything we have. No, I said, meeting his gaze without hesitation. You took credit for everything we had. The words landed harder than I expected. I saw it in his face, the brief flicker of something real before it was replaced by anger. You're unbelievable, he muttered. Am I? I asked. Yes, he said firmly. You've always been like this. Quiet, but judgmental. Acting like a victim instead of actually understanding what's going on. I felt the sting of that, sharper than I wanted to admit. But this time, I didn't let it silence me. I understand more than you think, I said. I understand that I've been carrying this family on my own for a long time. And I understand that you're not used to being called out for it. His eyes flashed. That's not what's happening. Then what is? I asked again. He didn't respond. Because there was nothing left to say. We stood there for a moment, facing each other like strangers who had somehow ended up in the same story. And then he shook his head, like he was done. "Call me when you cool down," he said, his voice flat, dismissive. The words hit differently this time, not like an invitation, but like a dismissal, like everything I had just said meant nothing. I watched him turn and walk away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, each one creating more distance between us. For a second, I thought about calling after him, about saying something, anything, to stop him from leaving like that. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew this wasn't something that could be fixed in a single conversation. This wasn't just about one argument. It was about years. Years of silence, of imbalance, of expectations that had never been questioned. And for the first time, I wasn't the one chasing after him. I stood there until he disappeared from view, until the corridor felt empty again. Then I turned back toward my mother's room. My hand paused on the door handle for a moment, my reflection staring back at me from the small glass window. I looked tired, worn down. But there was something else there too, something new, something steady. I took a slow breath and pushed the door open. Because no matter what had just happened outside that room, one thing hadn't changed. She still needed me. But as I stepped back inside, I realized something else. For the first time, I wasn't just doing this because I had to. I was doing it because I chose to, and that choice felt different. Stronger. Like the beginning of something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not obligation, not sacrifice, but clarity. And once you see things clearly, you can't unsee them. I didn't call him. Not that night, not the next morning. Not even when the silence stretched long enough to feel intentional. His last words echoed in my mind more than I wanted them to. "Call me when you cool down." As if I were the one who had lost control, as if everything I had said was just emotion, not truth. At first, the urge to respond was strong. My fingers hovered over my phone more times than I could count. I would open our chat, stare at the empty space beneath his last message, and imagine what I could say. Something sharp. Something undeniable. Something that would finally make him understand. But every version of that conversation ended the same way, with me explaining. With him dismissing. With nothing actually changing. So I stopped. Not out of weakness, but out of something that felt unfamiliar at first, restraint. A quiet decision to step back instead of stepping forward into the same cycle again. The silence wasn't easy. It pressed against me in unexpected moments. When I was sitting beside Mom's bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest. When I was walking down the hospital corridor alone, surrounded by strangers who all seemed to have someone beside them. When I heard other families talking in low voices, making decisions together, I noticed the absence then. Not just of him, but of what I had always hoped he would be. But something else started to grow in that space. Something steadier. For the first time in a long time, I stopped waiting. Stopped checking my phone every few minutes. Stopped anticipating his arrival, his input, his approval. Stopped building my decisions around someone who had never truly been present. Instead, I started focusing on what was in front of me. The doctors, the treatment plans, the endless stream of forms and questions that needed answers. At first, it felt overwhelming. I had always handled things. But there had always been this invisible assumption that Hamza was the one in charge, that his voice carried more weight, that his decisions mattered more. Now, there was no one else. And strangely, that made things clearer. I began asking more questions during consultations, not hesitating or second-guessing myself. I took notes, wrote down instructions, researched terms I didn't understand. I learned how to navigate conversations that once felt intimidating. There was no room left for uncertainty. Not when everything depended on it. I remember one afternoon when a doctor asked, "Who's responsible for making the final decisions?" For a split second, the old instinct surfaced, the urge to say, "Ah, my brother." But the words didn't come out. Instead, I said, "I am." It felt strange. Heavy. But also right. The more I stepped into that role, the more something inside me shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it stopped controlling me. It became something I carried alongside everything else, instead of something that held me back. Outside of the hospital, I started rebuilding in small, careful steps. I reached out to an old friend I hadn't spoken to in months. At first, I hesitated. I didn't know how to explain where I had been, what my life had become. I didn't know how to put all of that into words without feeling exposed. But when she answered, there was no judgment, just warmth, just concern. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to pretend. She told me about a remote job opportunity, something small, flexible, something I could manage alongside everything else. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something that belonged to me. I took it. The first night I worked, I sat in the corner of the hospital room, with my phone propped up against a stack of papers, typing slowly, carefully, trying to focus despite the constant interruptions. The glow of the screen lit up my hands, and for a moment, it reminded me of who I used to be. Not just someone who took care of others, but someone who had her own path. It wasn't easy. There were nights when exhaustion hit me so hard I could barely keep my eyes open. Nights when I made mistakes, had to redo tasks, felt like I was failing at everything all at once. And there were nights when the weight of everything, Mom's condition, the financial strain, the emotional exhaustion became too much. On those nights, I would lock myself in the hospital bathroom. It became my place to break. I would stand in front of the mirror, gripping the edge of the sink, my head bowed, my shoulders shaking as the tears finally came. Quiet at first, then heavier, harder to hold back. I never let myself cry in front of Mom. I couldn't. She needed to see strength, even if it was borrowed, even if it was fragile. So I saved the truth for those moments behind closed doors. I would cry until there was nothing left, until my chest felt hollow and my breathing steadied again. Then I would splash cold water on my face, stare at my reflection until it looked composed enough, and walk back out like nothing had happened, like I was still holding everything together. But something was changing, even in those moments. The crying didn't feel like weakness anymore. It felt like release. Like I was letting go of pieces of pain that had been building for too long. And each time I walked back into that room, I felt just a little bit stronger. Not because things were getting easier, but because I was learning how to carry them differently. Days turned into weeks. Mom's condition stabilized, slowly, carefully, like someone testing the strength of thin ice. There were still bad days, still moments of uncertainty, but there were also signs of improvement, small ones, but enough to hold on to. And through it all, I kept going. Not for recognition, not for validation, but because I had made a choice, a quiet, steady choice to stop abandoning myself in the process of taking care of everyone else. I started setting boundaries, even if they were small at first. I stopped answering calls immediately when I was overwhelmed. I stopped explaining myself to people who weren't truly listening. I stopped minimizing what I was going through just to make others comfortable. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. But it was powerful. Because for the first time, I was choosing myself, not instead of my responsibilities, but alongside them. And that made all the difference. There were still moments when the old patterns tried to pull me back. Moments when I felt the familiar urge to reach out to Hamza, to fill the silence, to return to what was known, even if it was painful. But each time, I paused, and each time, I chose not to. Because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Silence wasn't always emptiness. Sometimes it was space. Space to think. Space to grow. Space to finally hear your own voice without it being drowned out by everyone else's expectations. And in that space, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing. Myself, not the version of me that existed for others. Not the one who carried everything without question, but the one who could stand on her own, make her own decisions, and trust herself to handle whatever came next. It wasn't a complete transformation. I was still tired, still overwhelmed, still navigating a life that felt uncertain and fragile. But I wasn't the same person who had read that message at 20:13 a.m. Something inside me had shifted. Something quiet, but unshakable. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't chasing validation. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into a role that had never been fair to begin with. I was still here. Still carrying what mattered. But for the first time, I wasn't losing myself in the process. Weeks passed before I heard from him again. Not a message. Not a missed call. Nothing that hinted at hesitation or second thoughts. Just silence, thick, deliberate silence that stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of statement. At first, I noticed it. Then, slowly, I stopped. My days had settled into a rhythm that didn't leave much room for anything else. Mornings started early, usually before the sun had fully risen, when the hospital corridors were still quiet and the world outside felt distant. I would wake up stiff and sore from sleeping in the chair, stretch just enough to shake off the heaviness, and then check on Mom before anything else. Some days, she was more alert. Her eyes would follow me around the room, her voice soft but present when she spoke. Other days, she drifted in and out, her energy slipping away like something she couldn't quite hold on to. I learned to adjust without thinking, to take the good moments as they came and brace myself for the difficult ones without letting them break me. In between, there were conversations with doctors, paperwork, calls about bills, and the small pockets of time where I tried to keep up with work. It was a lot, but it was mine. Every decision, every step forward, every small victory, mine. That realization had settled into me in a way that felt both empowering and unsettling. There was no one else to defer to, no one to step in and take over when things became too much. But there was also no one left to diminish what I was doing. No one to overshadow it, and in that space, I had found a kind of balance I hadn't known I was capable of. So when my phone rang one afternoon and his name appeared on the screen, it didn't hit me the way it used to. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. I just looked at it. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, not out of anger or pettiness, but because I didn't feel that immediate pull anymore. That urgency to answer, to respond, to maintain something that had always felt one-sided. But then I picked it up. Hello. There was a brief pause on the other end, like he hadn't expected me to answer so calmly. I heard Mom's improving, he said. His voice was different, not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed. The sharpness was gone, replaced by something more measured, more careful. She is, I replied. A simple answer. No elaboration, no attempt to fill the silence that followed. Another pause, longer this time. I might come by this weekend, he said. The words hung in the air, waiting for approval, for resistance, for something. You can, I said. My voice was steady, neutral. But not for me. The silence that followed was immediate, thick, confused. I don't understand what that means, he said after a moment, his tone shifting slightly. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes drifting toward the window. The light outside was soft, late afternoon fading into evening. For a second, I focused on that instead of the conversation. On something calm, something distant. It means, I said slowly, choosing each word with care, that I'm not doing this the way I used to. He didn't respond right away, and for once, I didn't rush to fill the gap. I'm done being your backup plan, I continued, my voice still even. I'm done carrying everything while you show up when it's convenient and act like you've been part of it all along. There was a shift on the other end of the line. I could almost hear it, the tension, the instinct to push back, to defend, to argue. But it didn't come immediately. I never said that. He replied finally, though his voice lacked the usual certainty. You didn't have to, I said. Another pause. This one felt different, less defensive, more uncertain. If you want to be here, I went on, then be here. For real, not for appearances. Not when it suits you, but consistently. The word lingered between us, consistently. It was simple, but it carried everything I had been trying to say for years. And if I can't? He asked. The question caught me off guard, not because of what it meant, but because of how it was asked. Not with arrogance, not with dismissal, but with something that sounded almost like honesty. I thought about it for a moment. About everything that had led to this point. About the nights I had spent waiting, hoping, adjusting my expectations to fit his absence. About the version of myself who would have immediately softened, reassured him, made it easier for him to stay exactly as he was. That version of me felt distant now. If you can't, I said, my voice quiet but firm, then don't pretend that you are. The words settled heavily. Not as an attack, but as a boundary. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, not in the way it used to be. It wasn't filled with unspoken expectations or the need to fix something. It just existed. "I didn't realize you felt like this," he said eventually. I let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a quiet release. "That's the problem," I replied. "You didn't realize. Because you never really looked." It wasn't said with anger. Just truth. And for once, I didn't feel the need to soften it. "I was doing what I thought was right," he said. "I know," I said. And I meant it. That was the complicated part. He hadn't set out to hurt me. He hadn't made some deliberate decision to leave everything on my shoulders. He had simply lived his life in a way that centered himself, and everyone else had adjusted around that, including me. But understanding that didn't mean accepting it anymore. There was a difference now, a line that had finally been drawn. "I'm not asking you to be perfect," I continued. "I'm asking you to be present. There's a difference." Another pause, shorter this time. "I can try," he said. It wasn't a grand promise, it wasn't an apology. But it was the first thing he had said that felt real. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "That's up to you," I replied, because it was. For the first time, I wasn't holding that responsibility for him. I wasn't managing his involvement, adjusting my expectations, or filling in the gaps he left behind. If he showed up, it would be his choice. If he didn't, that would be his choice too. And either way, I would be okay. "I'll come this weekend," he said after a moment. "Okay," I replied. No hesitation, no emotional weight attached to it. Just acknowledgement. We ended the call shortly after. No dramatic closing. No lingering tension. Just an ending. I placed my phone down beside me and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me again. But this time, it felt different. Lighter. Not because everything had been resolved. Not because things were suddenly easy. But because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping for him to change in order for things to feel balanced. I had already found that balance within myself. Whatever he chose to do now would add to that, or not. But it wouldn't define it. I turned my attention back to my mother, adjusting her blanket slightly, checking the monitor, grounding myself in the present moment. The things that mattered. And as I moved through those familiar motions, I realized something quietly, but with complete certainty. This conversation hadn't been about confronting him. It had been about claiming something for myself. My time, my energy, my worth. Things I had given away too easily for too long. And now that I had taken them back, I wasn't going to lose them again. Weeks passed before I heard from him again. Not a message. Not a missed call. Nothing that hinted at hesitation or second thoughts. Just silence, thick, deliberate silence that stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of statement. At first, I noticed it. Then, slowly, I stopped. My days had settled into a rhythm that didn't leave much room for anything else. Mornings started early, usually before the sun had fully risen, when the hospital corridors were still quiet and the world outside felt distant. I would wake up stiff and sore from sleeping in the chair, stretch just enough to shake off the heaviness, and then check on Mom before anything else. Some days, she was more alert. Her eyes would follow me around the room, her voice soft but present when she spoke. Other days, she drifted in and out, her energy slipping away, like something she couldn't quite hold on to. I learned to adjust without thinking. To take the good moments as they came and brace myself for the difficult ones without letting them break me. In between, there were conversations with doctors, paperwork, calls about bills, and the small pockets of time where I tried to keep up with work. It was a lot, but it was mine. Every decision, every step forward, every small victory. Mine. That realization had settled into me in a way that felt both empowering and unsettling. There was no one else to defer to, no one to step in and take over when things became too much. But there was also no one left to diminish what I was doing. No one to overshadow it. And in that space, I had found a kind of balance I hadn't known I was capable of. So when my phone rang one afternoon, and his name appeared on the screen, it didn't hit me the way it used to. My heart didn't race. My breath didn't catch. I just looked at it. For a moment, I considered letting it ring, not out of anger or pettiness, but because I didn't feel that immediate pull anymore. That urgency to answer, to respond, to maintain something that had always felt one-sided. But then I picked it up. Hello. There was a brief pause on the other end, like he hadn't expected me to answer so calmly. I heard Mom's improving, he said. His voice was different. Not dramatically so, but enough that I noticed. The sharpness was gone, replaced by something more measured, more careful. She is, I replied. A simple answer. No elaboration. No attempt to fill the silence that followed. Another pause, longer this time. I might come by this weekend, he said. The words hung in the air, waiting for approval, for resistance, for something. You can, I said. My voice was steady, neutral, but not for me. The silence that followed was immediate, thick, confused. I don't understand what that means, he said after a moment, his tone shifting slightly. I leaned back in the chair, my eyes drifting toward the window. The light outside was soft, late afternoon fading into evening. For a second, I focused on that instead of the conversation. On something calm. Something distant. It means, I said slowly, choosing each word with care, that I'm not doing this the way I used to. He didn't respond right away. And for once, I didn't rush to fill the gap. I'm done being your backup plan, I continued, my voice still even. I'm done carrying everything while you show up when it's convenient and act like you've been part of it all along. There was a shift on the other end of the line. I could almost hear it, the tension, the instinct to push back, to defend, to argue. But it didn't come immediately. I never said that, he replied finally, though his voice lacked the usual certainty. You didn't have to, I said. Another pause. This one felt different. Less defensive. If you want to be here, I went on, then be here, for real. Not for appearances. Not when it suits you, but consistently. The word lingered between us. Consistently. It was simple, but it carried everything I had been trying to say for years. And if I can't? He asked. The question caught me off guard, not because of what it meant, but because of how it was asked. Not with arrogance. Not with dismissal. But with something that sounded almost like honesty. I thought about it for a moment. About everything that had led to this point. About the nights I had spent waiting, hoping, adjusting my expectations to fit his absence. About the version of myself who would have immediately softened, reassured him, made it easier for him to stay exactly as he was. That version of me felt distant now. If you can't, I said, my voice quiet but firm, then don't pretend that you are. The words settled heavily, not as an attack, but as a boundary. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, not in the way it used to be. It wasn't filled with unspoken expectations or the need to fix something. It just existed. I didn't realize you felt like this, he said eventually. I let out a small breath, something between a sigh and a quiet release. That's the problem, I replied. You didn't realize. Because you never really looked. It wasn't said with anger. Just truth. And for once, I didn't feel the need to soften it. I was doing what I thought was right, he said. I know, I said. And I meant it. That was the complicated part. He hadn't set out to hurt me. He hadn't made some deliberate decision to leave everything on my shoulders. He had simply lived his life in a way that centered himself, and everyone else had adjusted around that, including me. But understanding that didn't mean accepting it anymore. There was a difference now, a line that had finally been drawn. I'm not asking you to be perfect, I continued. I'm asking you to be present. There's a difference. Another pause. Shorter this time. I can try, he said. It wasn't a grand promise. It wasn't an apology, but it was the first thing he had said that felt real. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. That's up to you, I replied. Because it was. For the first time, I wasn't holding that responsibility for him. I wasn't managing his involvement, adjusting my expectations, or filling in the gaps he left behind. If he showed up, it would be his choice. If he didn't, that would be his choice too. And either way, I would be okay. I'll come this weekend, he said after a moment. Okay, I replied. No hesitation. No emotional weight attached to it. Just acknowledgement. We ended the call shortly after. No dramatic closing. No lingering tension. Just an ending. I placed my phone down beside me and sat there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me again. But this time, it felt different. Lighter. Not because everything had been resolved. Not because things were suddenly easy. But because something had shifted in a way that couldn't be undone. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping for him to change in order for things to feel balanced. I had already found that balance within myself. Whatever he chose to do now would add to that or not. But it wouldn't define it. I turned my attention back to my mother, adjusting her blanket slightly, checking the monitor, grounding myself in the present moment. The things that mattered. And as I moved through those familiar motions, I realized something quietly, but with complete certainty. This conversation hadn't been about confronting him. It had been about claiming something for myself. My time. My energy. My worth. Things I had given away too easily for too long. And now that I had taken them back, I wasn't going to lose them again. He came that weekend. Not late. Not rushing in with an excuse already waiting on his lips. Just on time. I noticed it immediately. It wasn't something I would have paid attention to before. In the past, I would have been too focused on the fact that he showed up at all, willing to overlook everything else just to hold on to that small effort. But now, I saw the details. The way he walked into the room without checking his phone first. The way his eyes went directly to Mom instead of scanning the space like he was calculating how long he needed to stay. Small things. But they mattered. I stepped aside as he approached her bed, giving him space without saying anything. There was no tension in the air. No unspoken argument waiting to pick up where it had left off. Just a quiet awareness of everything that had changed. He stood there for a moment, looking at her. Really looking. I watched his expression shift, subtle but real. Something softened around his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Hey, Mom," he said quietly. His voice sounded different, not louder or stronger, just present. She stirred slightly, her eyes opening slowly as if the effort itself required more energy than it used to. When she saw him, there was a flicker of recognition, followed by something warmer. "Relief. You came?" she whispered. Two simple words, but they landed heavier than anything else in the room. He nodded, pulling a chair closer and sitting down beside her. "Yeah. I'm here." I turned away then, not wanting to intrude on that moment. Not wanting to analyze it or measure it against everything that had come before. Because for once, I wasn't keeping score. I moved toward the window, giving them space, letting the quiet settle around me. Outside, the sky was a soft shade of gray, the kind that made everything feel still, suspended between one moment and the next. Behind me, I could hear their voices, low, uneven at times, but steady. It wasn't perfect. There were pauses where he didn't know what to say, moments where she seemed too tired to respond. But he stayed. That was the difference. He didn't fill the silence with distractions. He didn't check his watch. He didn't leave after a few minutes with a quick excuse. He stayed. Hours passed. At some point, a doctor came in to discuss her progress. Normally, I would have stepped forward automatically, answering questions, asking for clarification, guiding the conversation without even thinking about it. This time, I didn't. I stood back, and I watched. Hamza listened carefully, his posture more attentive than I had ever seen it in this setting. He asked questions, real ones, not just surface-level inquiries. He took notes, his brow slightly furrowed as he processed the information. I noticed the way he hesitated once, glancing at me briefly before speaking again. It wasn't for approval, it was acknowledgement. Like he understood, at least in part, that this space wasn't his alone to navigate. That it never had been. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to step in and correct or control anything. I let him figure it out. Because that was part of showing up too. After the doctor left, there was a quiet moment where neither of us spoke. The room felt different now, balanced in a way I wasn't used to. Not equal. Not yet. But no longer entirely one-sided. "You've been handling all of this?" he asked finally, his voice lower than usual. I looked at him for a second before answering. "Wes." No elaboration, no list of everything I had done. Just the truth. He nodded slowly, like he was trying to absorb something that hadn't fully registered before. "I didn't realize." He started, then stopped. I didn't fill in the rest for him. Because whatever he was starting to understand, That was something he needed to arrive at on his own. "It's a lot," he said instead. I almost smiled. Not because of what he said, but because of how he said it. There was no comparison in his tone. No attempt to measure his own effort against mine. Just a simple acknowledgement. "It is," I replied. Another pause. But this one wasn't uncomfortable. It felt honest. He stayed the rest of the day. And when evening came, he didn't rush out. "I'll come back tomorrow," he said as he stood up, glancing between me and Mom. I nodded. "Okay." Again, no weight attached. Just acceptance. After he left, the room felt quiet again, but not empty. There was a difference. Mom looked more at ease, her breathing steady, her expression softer than it had been in days. "You should rest," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. I smiled faintly. "I will." But I didn't move right away. I sat there for a while, letting everything settle. The past few weeks replayed in my mind, not in sharp detail, but in fragments. The message at 20:13 a.m., the silence that followed, the conversations, the decisions, the moments where something inside me had shifted in ways I hadn't fully understood at the time. And now this. This unexpected, imperfect attempt at something different. I didn't mistake it for a complete change. I wasn't naive enough to believe that one weekend could undo years of imbalance. But I also didn't dismiss it. Because growth, real growth, rarely looks dramatic. It looks like this. Small steps, uncertain efforts, moments where someone chooses to stay instead of leave. The next day he came back, and the day after that, not for long stretches at first, but longer than before. Long enough to matter. We didn't suddenly become close. There were no emotional conversations where everything was laid out and resolved. No apologies wrapped in perfect words. But there was something else. Consistency, and that was new. We started falling into a rhythm, awkward at times, but functional. We shared responsibilities without needing to define them. Some days he handled conversations with the doctors. Other days I did. Sometimes we sat in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, but no longer carrying everything alone. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something loosen inside me. Not the responsibility, not the care, but the weight of doing it all by myself. One evening, as I was gathering my things to step out for a short break, he spoke again. "You've been doing more than I realized," he said. I paused, glancing at him. There was no defensiveness in his expression this time. No pride trying to overshadow the moment. Just recognition. I nodded once. "I have." He held my gaze for a second longer, like he wanted to say more. But he didn't. And that was okay. Because this wasn't about hearing the perfect apology. It wasn't about rewriting the past or making everything fair in retrospect. It was about the present. About what we chose to do now. I stepped out into the corridor, the familiar hum of the hospital surrounding me. But something felt different, lighter. Not because everything had been fixed, but because I had stopped waiting for it to be. I leaned against the wall for a moment, closing my eyes, letting myself breathe without the constant pressure that had once filled every part of me. And in that quiet pause, I understood something clearly. This story had never really been about him. Or about what he did or didn't do. It was about me. About the version of myself who had carried everything in silence, who had believed that love meant giving until there was nothing left. And about the version of myself who had finally learned that it didn't. I hadn't become stronger because things had gotten easier. I had become stronger because I had changed the way I showed up for myself. Because I had drawn a line where there hadn't been one before. Because I had chosen to stop shrinking, stop explaining, stop proving. And once you make that choice, everything else starts to shift around it. I opened my eyes and straightened, pushing myself away from the wall. Inside that room, Mom was resting. And for once, I knew she wasn't alone. But more importantly, neither was I. Not in the way that had once felt suffocating. I wasn't carrying everything anymore. I was choosing what was mine to carry. And I was finally letting go of the rest.